Jonathan Dimbleby on the record.
Good afternoon and welcome to On the Record. First, an apology to those of you who are expecting to see our report on women and the family. We will be covering that important issue, but on another Sunday. Today, though, after the news this morning that the emergency summit in Rome has left the Prime Minister entirely isolated over the future of the European community, we ask where Britain goes from here. The news is that the other 11 members of the community are now apparently agreed that Europe must adopt a single currency regulated by an independent central bank, and that this process should begin in January 1994 with a view to having the system in full swing by the year 2000. In this programme we will hear from the chairman of the Council of Ministers, the Italian Foreign Minister Gianni De Michelis. We also have the results of a poll of British MPs commissioned by On the Record to discover backbench opinion about Britain's future in Europe. And on this issue, which after today's news will assuredly become more divisive than ever, we hear the passionately held but sharply conflicting opinions of prominent Conservative MPs. What do they think the Prime Minister should and will do now? Then we profile the newest face in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, who after the departure of Nicholas Ridley has emerged from obscurity to become her most certain ally in her stand on Europe. John Cole will be assessing the political fallout of the news from Rome, as well as delivering his usual end-of-programme report from the ringside seat in Parliament, where apparently there is again some gossip about the future of the Prime Minister. The decision to call this summit was taken by the Italians, who have in effect bounced the Prime Minister into a clash with the rest of Europe, which the government hoped to postpone, if not avoid. So first, a brief reminder of how Britain reached this unpalatable pass. This was the summit that Mrs. Thatcher didn't want. It was never on her agenda to discuss the bête noire of economic and monetary union before the intergovernmental conference starting in December. But by calling this summit, the Italians forced the issue, and from now on it simply won't go away. At stake is the very structure of Europe, and at the core of a critical debate is the divisive question of a single currency. The debate began in earnest in April last year when the President of the Commission, Jacques Delors, set out his three-stage plan for economic and monetary union, or EMU for short. The first stage was the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism. Now that the pound is inside, that is virtually complete. In stage 2, which many Europeans hope to see in operation from January 1994, Jacques Delors wants the national banks of Europe working as one, but retaining their independence. Then in stage 3, there would be only one central bank, of which the Bank of England and the other national banks would become in effect regional branches. Stage 3 would also involve currency union, the replacement of each national currency by a single currency throughout the community. With the exception of Britain, every European nation has agreed in principle to all these proposals. And for the rest of Europe, therefore, the debate is not about the principle, but the timetable, about when and at what speed. But for Mrs. Thatcher, the Delors plan is anathema. For her, the completion of stage 3 involves the surrender of British sovereignty, the death knell of Parliament. However, her Chancellor John Major was given the go-ahead to devise an alternative to stage 2. The Major plan sidesteps any commitment to a single currency and avoids setting a timetable. Instead, he proposes that the existing European currency, the ECU, which comprises a little bit of every national currency, should float freely on the international exchange. Each member state would link its own currency to this so-called hard ECU. And eventually, if and only if all agreed, it could evolve into the single European currency. The Major plan would also establish a new institution to regulate the hard ECU, the European Monetary Fund, which could be seen as a central bank in embryo. So far, the Europeans have been distinctly lukewarm towards the British proposal. But the European Commissioner Sir Leon Brittan believes that at least it won't be ignored if the government were to acknowledge, in principle, that our ultimate destiny is indeed the same as that of the other 11.
Now, John Major's plan would stand quite a chance of being considered seriously now that we have joined the ERM if Britain were just to add one sentence to the existing plan to make it clear that it does regard this as being a step on the way towards a single currency.
By this means, according to Sir Leon, the British could also reject the single currency in practice, because it would be left for individual parliaments to decide if and when to take that final step. John Major is evidently reluctant to make such a commitment. But this week again, he went out of his way to make it clear that his proposals are at least compatible with the European goal of a single currency.
They leave open the possibility of the hard AQ evolving towards a parallel currency, but only a single currency if that were the wish of governments and of peoples.
But the Prime Minister's approach is notably different from that of the Chancellor. On the very same day, she left no one in any doubt that her opposition to the single currency is adamant and absolute.
A single European currency would mean a form of economic and monetary union under which this House gave up control of monetary policy and economic policy. Is the Right Honourable Gentleman's policy to come into this House only in order to denude it of its powers?
The question now is whether, or for how long, the Prime Minister can hold the line. The Conservatives would dearly like to postpone the crunch until after the next election, not least to save the party from the potential cataclysm of a civil war over Britain's future in Europe. But the Europeans are clearly in the mood to press ahead, and at the very least, to establish whether Britain will or will not sign up in principle for their goal of full economic and monetary union. The answer can't be long delayed. So there's the background to what happened in Rome. Now to the foreground. What is the meaning of Britain's isolation on the issue of economic and monetary union now that the other 11 are clearly determined to press ahead? First on this from Rome, John Palmer, the European editor of The Guardian, who's long specialised in these matters. John, this is a clash that's taken most people, a crunch point, taken most people by surprise.
Yes, I think possibly most people were taken by surprise, but they shouldn't have been. The Italian government, the current presidency of the community, has been determined to put some political momentum into the whole process of European Union. This has been a very remarkable weekend. In essence, a date has more or less been fixed for the start of the next crucial stage of monetary union, which will involve the setting up of a supranational central bank in 1994, and a decision to follow possibly sooner than 3 years after that to go to the final stage of a single currency. In addition, the 11 heads of government have indicated quite clearly they want to move further and faster to some kind of political union. I'm afraid Mrs. Thatcher was in not only her customary minority of one, but frankly exercised no discernible influence over the weekend's events.
Can you outline the impact of the bank that they are going to move towards? What does that mean in terms of the British debate on national sovereignty?
Yes, well, the central bank will have really the sole authority for monetary policy in the final stage of economic and monetary union, which ultimately determines interest rates and a wide variety of other economic facts of life. Those decisions will in future, when this has been put in place, be taken both by the Council of Ministers in Brussels and by the central bank, which will have autonomy in day-to-day operation of monetary policy.
John, does this
in her press conference here, a frankly rather angry Mrs. Thatcher denounced the whole idea and said she would not preside over the liquidation of the pound sterling, and she spoke in very strong language about the threat to national sovereignty. I read her as more or less making a political declaration of war on the entire project, and her Foreign Secretary, Mr. Douglas Hurd, sitting beside her, didn't look entirely comfortable with her choice of language on all occasions in this press conference.
That's very interesting. Do you detect any sign that the other 11 are in any way able to be deterred from their objective by the Prime Minister's approach or not?
No, I think that they have frankly written Mrs. Thatcher off in terms of any substantial concessions to the British view on the fundamentals. There are concessions to the British view on some technical aspects of the preparation for a single currency. It's quite possible that aspects of the British hard ECU plan could be built into the final transitional phase to a single currency, but only clearly within the framework of that political commitment.
Do the other
like some of the things?
Sorry, do the other Europeans, John, have a clear sense of when, if the train is now leaving the station, when Britain has to be on it if Britain wants to be on it?
Well, I think that final decision will be taken at the December summit or very soon thereafter. And somebody said to me as we came away, the loudest noise that you could hear in Rome this weekend was of another European train beginning to leave the station. I think that Mrs. Thatcher had not expected the degree of unanimity and will to get that train moving. There are still 3 months to jump aboard, but it's starting already to pick up speed, and I suspect that she will have to resolve this issue inside the cabinet very quickly indeed, not to risk missing the train.
John, thank you very much in Rome. We'll be going back to Rome. But here in Britain, the battle between and within the parties over Europe will, of course, be fought out in the political hothouse at Westminster. The Prime Minister has insisted that Parliament is overwhelmingly behind her. And indeed, she can cite the last vote on Europe just about a year ago when the great majority of both parties rejected Delors Stage 3. But the European agenda is changing extremely fast. So to find out what our elected representatives now think about the economic and monetary union, we commissioned a poll from Online Telephone Surveys, a subsidiary of Mori. Its findings will undoubtedly give the leadership of both main parties pause for thought, for the evidence suggests that backbench opinion is not nearly so hostile to the European agenda as many people have hitherto thought. Altogether, the pollsters contacted a representative sample of 126 British MPs, that's excluding ministers and their shadows. They reached 70 Conservatives and 56 from the opposition parties. That's more than 1 in 5 of all British backbenchers. And incidentally, the total accurately reflects the balance of power in the House. The MPs were interviewed by telephone between last Thursday and yesterday. Asked whether they would support or oppose a single European currency, a majority, 54%, said they would favour it, including almost half of the 70 Conservatives and 2/3 of the opposition. On the issue of whether they would support or oppose the idea of a European central bank, half said they were in support and a little over 1/3 were against. Once again, in party terms, there are fewer Tories than opposition who like the idea. Asked if there were to be such a bank, whether it should be under political control like the Bank of England or independent like the Bundesbank, 35% said it should be under political control. But a majority, 60%, said it should be independent, a view held overwhelmingly by Tory MPs. As to whether they thought the community, including Britain, would have a single currency within the next 10 years, a majority said this was likely. Asked the same question and offered a 20-year time span, no less than 7 out of 10 of our MPs said this was likely. Only 20% begged to differ. And now, to pick up some of the thoughts about that and the implications here, John Cole, you've been watching what's happening. You saw that poll. The indication it seems to give to the Prime Minister in this extremely strong stand that she's been taking today, as we heard from John Palmer, is that she can't, at least in the medium term, look for the overwhelming support from the whole of the House that she might have expected.
I think British public opinion and political opinion is all over the shop on this issue at the moment. They haven't really honed in on the decision. This morning's events in Rome will undoubtedly bring the debate forward much faster. But at the moment, on the basis of that poll, it does look that MPs at this moment, including Conservative MPs, are prepared to go further down the European road than Mrs. Thatcher would like to go, though not necessarily than some members of her cabinet would like to go.
Well, let's come to that, because if the decision has to be made soon, if the government can't postpone the decision, there is presumably the potential for, in the first case, very open divisions
on the Conservative benches? We know the disagreement is there, but this is going to have to come out into the open, is it not?
Oh, well, when this issue really comes to the crunch, both parties will be divided, both Labour and Conservative parties. It's very difficult for the Labour Party as well. Conservatives happen to be in government. Up to now, their strategy has been to try to kick for touch until after the British general election and not face the party and the cabinet with the kind of decisions that are likely to be divisive. But I do think that probably Europe will go slower than we have thought from this morning's indications, but probably Britain will have to go quicker in decision taking. In other words, more quickly the cabinet will have to get down to considering whether a single European currency is feasible at any time. Mrs. Thatcher won't go along with it, but a future Conservative Prime Minister might.
It's not possible, am I right, for the cabinet now to presume that the thing can be kept in touch or kicked into touch until after the election?
I think it may be too soon to say that. On the face of it this morning from Rome, it looks difficult. And of course, what Conservative backbenchers will be taking note of, that business seems overwhelmingly determined to go along with what what the other European powers do. That's very difficult for a Conservative government and for their MPs.
How sharp is the divide actually, in your judgment, within the cabinet?
I think it is quite sharp. I wouldn't like to give the impression that John Major or Douglas Hurd or any of the rest are exactly prepared to accept the Italian presidency's view of rushing ahead at this speed. They will want to ask a lot of political questions, but they undoubtedly are more inclined than the Prime Minister to think that eventually, sometime in the next century, there will be a single European currency. She doesn't want to contemplate that at all, but that is partly a function, of course, of her the period in her premiership.
OK, I want to pick up this debate with our MPs here in a moment, but first I think that we can now go back to Rome, where the decision to press the question of economic and monetary union at this summit was taken by the Italian government, which holds the presidency of the Council of Ministers. In Rome now, the chairman of the Council of Foreign Ministers, just emerging from his press conference and from all the meetings he's been having, the Italian Foreign Minister Gianni De Michelis. Your Excellency, it's been quite a dramatic weekend, more dramatic than people had thought. Can I establish with you what in fact has been decided by the 11? Are we right that the objective of a single bank, of a central bank, of a single currency, the process to begin in January 1994, is now absolutely, unequivocally agreed by the other 11 members of the community?
Yes, I do think so. In a certain sense, the final communiqué of the meeting of the European Council has given a sort of mandate to the Intergovernmental Conference of December, which has been agreed by 11 members, and on some points there is a reservation by the British government. But also the text of this reservation is not completely negative. On some points there is an agreement, and so we do hope that in the next weeks, before the conference, it would be possible to reach further agreements. And in any case, the existing differences could be settled during the conference, taking into account that on the important points, the other 11 countries are totally agreeing.
Now, on that total agreement, there's no reason, are you saying, why Britain should not be able to participate in the conference, even if the Prime Minister is making it very clear that there are no circumstances under which she would sign up for a single currency? She could still take part in the conference despite that.
Well, as it is written in the communiqué, the objective of a single currency is totally agreed by the 11 countries. But in any case, the single currency will arrive only in the so-called third phase. And it is quite clear that all the 11 countries are agreeing on the fact that the passage to the first phase will be agreed not in the conference, but after the conference and after the modification of the treaty through a passage in the European Council. That means that in the 3 years later, the beginning of the second phase, there will be a report. The report will be examined by the finance minister, it will be examined by the foreign minister, and at the end there will be a decision of the European Council. So, in a certain sense, also Great Britain will have the possibility on the passage of the third phase to give a last word. So I do think that this type of very flexible, very pragmatic and very step-by-step approach is not at all excluding a possibility of a substantial agreement at the end also with the United Kingdom, on the second phase, conditions, date, European Bank and so on.
But Your Excellency, forgive me, the 11 are saying, are they not, that this process will now begin in January 1994. Stage 2 starts then. Whatever it may in detail contain, it actually starts in 94 January.
Yes, obviously. It will start. There are some objective conditions which are listed in the communique. I do think there are 5 conditions. One is to have the treaty ratified by the national parliaments, the modification of the treaties. Another condition is to have most of the European currencies participating in EMS. A third condition is to have the certainty of the independence of the new institution, the new European Bank, and so on. These are objective conditions, and obviously the date is fixed for giving a sort of target to the member state and to the community for taking into account this condition. But these
Minister,
are very objective conditions.
Minister, has not the Commission and the Italian government, in effect, this weekend, embarrassingly bounced Britain into saying very sharply, as the Prime Minister has done this morning, we're not having any of this? Why did you do that?
No, I don't think so. You know, the conference on monetary union has been agreed 1 year ago in Strasbourg, and the second conference has been agreed between March and June of this year, and it was quite clear to everybody, including the British government, that it was necessary to make a preparation to arrive to some conclusion for having the possibility to start the conference. The conference is not a discussion, a free discussion. It is a diplomatic and political negotiation between member states, among member states, and every member state has the possibility to participate and obviously to influence the negotiation.
But sorry, Minister, when that conference begins, does it have to be assumed that the goal is as set out today by the 11, or does it not have to be assumed?
No, the goal is that a sort of mandate has been given.
So under those circumstances, forgive me, so under those circumstances, Britain will be participating in that conference usefully only if it is very clear that Britain has indeed signed up for the broad principle of those objectives.
Well, you know, we must be confident and positive. I do repeat, this is a negotiation. The fact that the position were and are different was very well known to everybody. And we do hope and we are convinced that at the end we will find a way for maintaining the unity of the 12 member states.
That's a very diplomatic...
Please.
I'm so sorry. So sorry, carry on.
Only one sentence.
Yes,
At the same time, it is quite clear that Great Britain and the British government has to take into account that there is a full agreement between 11 member states. And so that's important. I do know that the conference can end only with an unanimity decision, but at the same time, the European public opinion and the British public opinion must know very well that on some important objectives there is a full agreement among 11 member states. Now, that will influence, I do hope, also the evolution of the British position.
Now, given the British position as it now is, if the Prime Minister persists in taking that line through the conference and says, no, we are not going along with this, and she said that as unambiguously as it is possible for any one person to say it, does she, can she, and what effect would it have if she sought to use the veto to prevent this taking place?
Well, I do hope that we will not arrive to a veto. I do remember that at the end of the 70s, when the decision was taken for European monetary system, at the end it was possible to take into account the differences of some member states, including United Kingdom, and the possibility to go ahead. I do hope that this time we could really arrive to a total agreement of the 12 member states, but in any case we must be confident. If we do remember the position of the British government of 18 months ago with respect to the monetary union, we can see how much way we have done and how much steps forward have already been done. And so I am convinced that this type of discussion is very important. I do consider the British reservation phrased in a positive way, giving space for further discussion and in the conference to a real negotiation. And so I do think that the Council has been a very positive one. In any case, it was necessary being the British position one of the problems, it was necessary to give clearly to the European public opinion and to the different institutions in the different countries and to the business community a clear signal of the will of the objectives of the majority.
Minister?
And in this case, the majority have been 11 member states on 12.
Minister, if the major plan is to have a chance of running, will it be necessary for Britain to say before the conference begins, to find a form of words at least before the conference begins, which suggests that Britain will accept the principle at some stage of a single currency?
I do hope so. In my view,
is it necessary? Is it necessary?
To underline to the British public opinion the fact that the agreement which we have reached today takes into consideration some parts of the major plan. For instance, the importance to have a strong key in the second phase, and takes into account also some compromise proposal put forward, for instance, by the Dutch and the Spanish finance minister, exactly for going the direction of the British position.
But Minister,
so it's not a closed decision excluding to take into consideration the British position. Exactly the contrary.
Now, if you're
we are evolving in the direction of trying to find a real convergence, and I do repeat, I do hope that at the end the British government, making a sort of cost-benefit analysis, will make the right choice. That means to make an effort, and we will try to do the same effort on our side, for render possible a full participation of the United Kingdom.
Forgive me for interrupting you, Minister. There's so much to get through. Just in a word, if the major plan, as you're suggesting, can be part of the process of negotiation, is it, however, a precondition for that plan being taken seriously, just in a word, that Britain makes it clear at the start of the conference or before that we will in the end accept the principle of a single currency, or will it be taken seriously even if Britain doesn't make that clear?
Yeah, but I do think in the mandate, in the document, in the conclusion of the today's council, there is a way for creating the possibility of a convergence, because I do repeat, it is clearly stated that the 11 member states do want to arrive at the end of the decade to a single European currency, but it also states very clearly that the third phase will be approved by the European Council. That means at unanimity with the participation of the United Kingdom, after a very correct examination of the result of the second phase. And I have to remind that the British position has said that if the market will bring one of the European currencies to become overwhelming on the other, Great Britain is ready to accept this fact. So the difference is between a only market-oriented process or a process in which it is possible, discussing the condition and the situation, to take a decision in this direction. I don't think that the positions are so different.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for coming here to join us after what must have been an excessively interesting and busy weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you.
And now back home again to the divisions here. The divisions among Conservative MPs are now reflected in the views of three backbenchers who are with me. Teddy Taylor is one of those who believes that economic and monetary union would mean the death of national sovereignty in Britain, and that is the destiny to which he fears we're being driven. Michael Knowles, who believes that economic and monetary union is crucial to Britain's future. And from Leeds, Tony Favour, who's just resigned as Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Chancellor John Major in order to speak his mind freely on Europe in the belief that Britain can and will stay out. Mr Favour, can I ask you first for your reaction to today's news? Are you encouraged by what the Prime Minister says, or are you anxious that now the pass has been sold?
Well, I don't think the pass has been sold. I think it's quite clear now that the 11 are heading towards single currency, central bank, common economic policy, possibly common social policy as well, and almost certainly the United States of Europe within the next 10 years. What we've got to decide now is whether we want that, whether we want to remain a self-governing country, or whether we want to go along with them. It's quite clear now where the train's going. Now,
you were worried, and that's why you left, that we were slipping inexorably onto that train. Do you have doubts, therefore? There have been some questions about John Major's position. Do you have doubts that he may not be able to hold the line, or may not even seek to hold the line?
Well, John Major's made it perfectly clear that he would not seek to impose a single currency on this country without the country's consent. And indeed, he's made it clear that he's not a federalist. I mean, you must ask these questions of him. And I didn't resign because of any difference between me and John Major.
No, I understand.
But because I foresaw what was going to happen this week, and I, as a backbencher, wanted to take part in the debate over Britain's future. I mean, the biggest debate in, what, 200 or 300 years.
And are you fearful that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet will be driven ineluctably down that slippery slope, and that's why you want to speak out?
Yes.
And why do you fear, given what the Prime Minister has publicly said about her opposition, and given what John Major has said in public, why are you fearful that they will be dragged down the slope?
Well, I'm fearful because there are a number of my colleagues who are in favour of a federal state. And that is clear from the poll which you've conducted this weekend. You didn't ask me, incidentally, but that
would have shifted the balance by one for sure. But when you say when you say that you are fearful, are you saying that you, despite what the Prime Minister has said, that you're fearful the lady may be for turning?
I don't think the lady's for turning. It may be that people may seek to turn her, and ultimately, of course, she's not going to be with us forever. What I want to make sure is that the argument is won in Parliament and with the people, that we remain a self-governing country.
And you think it can be won?
That's what this argument is all about.
And you think it can still be won?
Oh, of course it can. We've managed perfectly well for 1,000 years. There's no reason why we shouldn't continue to do so.
OK, hold on for a moment. Teddy Taylor, as I understand, you rather feel that the argument has already been lost.
Yes, I think it's a nonsense to make a big thing about this European currency, because in fact the pass has been sold. If we have ERM and say we're linked, the independence Britain would have, we would rather like having a Scottish pound note. And that poll you took was after ERM. I think the great danger about the EEC is people are constantly kidding themselves. And I think once we have the ERM decision and say our pound is linked, then obviously any difference is simply presentational. And that's why I think it's terribly important people should realise what's happening. Say we take control by a central bank. If people don't like what Mrs. Thatcher's doing, if they don't like what Mr. Kinnock's doing, they can get rid of them. The tragedy is, if we had economic policy run by a central bank, and people in Leeds and Glasgow and Southend felt it was terrible, there's nothing they can do. The big issue is not, in fact, the transfer to a common currency. The big issue is really the disappearance of our democracy.
So you think the Prime Minister, in effect, despite what she is saying on this, has already sold the past, that this debate is a fruitless debate that's been
I think
held?
it's rather fruitless in presentation, with the one difference. The difference is with ERM you can still pull out. Now, of course, the government have said we've no intention of pulling out. Mr. Major said we're not going to realign. The one slight difference which still remains is we have got the right to withdraw from ERM. My hope, of course, is that as a result of these apparent political disagreements, we might just get to the situation whereby there'd be a two-tier Europe. Remember, Mrs. Thatcher, I think, and I'm sure everyone else, is fed up. We don't have free trade. We have a common market that can't solve problems like agricultural policy. And what we're saying is, why go more and more and more into it when they can't even solve the basic problem of free trade, which is what we joined for?
Michael Knowles, are you encouraged by what has happened this weekend, or does it not create greater problems for those of you who believe strongly that we ought to be going into that European destiny?
Well, the truth is, time will tell. But I think it was inevitable. Certainly, I was in Rome a couple of weeks ago, and one got the feeling there, speaking to people in the Italian government, that they were determined to push ahead, and they're in the chair of the ministers at the moment. And there is a general feeling in Europe that the British will always drag their feet. 16 years late in joining a community, 11 years late in joining the exchange rate mechanism. If we go ahead with the common currency, sooner or later the British will come in due course. And we've created that atmosphere ourselves by our own reactions. One of the things I do agree with Tony about when he was speaking, I hope this does spark a debate in this country about the political future of the community. The problem is it has always been treated as a glorified free trade area in British politics. It has always been intended to be a lot more than that, and it's about time we really grapple with that argument.
Now, you have heard from John Palmer at the beginning of this programme that the Prime Minister expressed herself angrily and vehemently in opposition to what you believe. Do you think that she can turn on this, as Mr. Favour appears to fear she might be?
I think she might. If people want to, you can always find a form of words. I can remember John commenting the other week when we entered the ERM, saying, did this actually fulfil the conditions that are outlined at Madrid, and casting doubt on that. If people do want to do something, they can do it and can cover their tracks doing it as well.
Well, who's capable of turning it around in the Cabinet?
It's going to be an argument in the Cabinet, within the party and within the country. I think this is the time, and it's about time we had this discussion in this country.
Are you hopeful, you didn't quite answer my question, although it was an interesting diversion, are you hopeful that, for instance, John Major's alleged, or what some people have detected as his ambiguity, will in fact make it possible for Britain to go into the Intergovernmental Conference effectively nodding and winking and saying, yes, we're going to buy something like a single currency at the end of the road, and certainly we're ready to go in and start business in January 94?
Whether we'll go in January 94, I'm not sure. But I think we will actually, any government is going to be wise enough to leave itself several exits if it can. You don't deliberately, when you're in a community of 12, you don't seek to leave yourself in a position where you're outnumbered 11-1.
Now, if the Prime Minister, if the crunch does come, and the Prime Minister does say, I'm not going in, will you then take action, or will you demurely accept that, your wing of the pro-European party?
No, I've been stating my position for a long time, just as Teddy has, and I've always said Europe is one of those great issues you get in politics every 50 or 100 years that has the potential to change the whole shape of politics, and I think it's in that order.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Mr. Fable, thank you for joining us, and both of you. We're hoping soon to hear from Mrs. Thatcher, but before that, just to look a little bit further at the sort of support she might have. If there is to be a major bust-up over Europe, and even if there is not, the Prime Minister will need every ally she can muster. She lost her principal loyalist in the Cabinet when Nicholas Ridley was forced to resign after being exceptionally critical of Germany in the European Commission. But she moved quickly to shore up her support, plucking a relatively obscure junior minister and putting him in Mr. Ridley's place. As a member of the No Turning Back group, she could trust him, at the very least, to fight unequivocally for her side of the argument. His name is Peter Lilly. So who is he? What does he believe? And why?
Pictures of Lily, Lily, oh Lily, Lily, oh Lily, pictures of Lily.
There was an unexpected star at this year's Conservative Party conference.
Anyway, what this shuffling money from one account to another boils down to is just the economics of Arthur Scargill. I don't quite understand how it works, but it seems you start with a big union and a small house, and you end with a small union and a big house.
A 4-minute standing ovation and a triumph for party right-wingers who have a new champion to fight for their radical agenda. This was quite an achievement for a virtually unknown politician. He can still enjoy a drink with his wife Gail without being buttonholed about the finer intricacies of competition policy. A recent poll found that only 2% of the population could recognise him. He remembers the July weekend when Nicholas Ridley suddenly resigned over his remarks in The Spectator about Europe.
Vividly, we'd just returned from the St Albans Horse Show rather belatedly in the afternoon and found notices from the police saying, please phone our Hertfordshire operations room, thought that some terrible disaster. And they in turn told us to phone number 10, which I did, and got through to the Prime Minister, who asked me to take over from Nick Ridley.
Peter Lilly has been member for St Albans only since 1983, taking just 7 years to reach the Cabinet. Only one of his political generation beat him to it, Employment Secretary Michael Howard. But his political profile was much higher than Peter Lilly's, who spent all of his career buried in the back rooms of the Treasury. So why did Mrs Thatcher decide to promote him? Thinking about a political replacement for Nicholas Ridley, Mrs Thatcher ignored candidates from the centre-left. It's thought she may be designing a radical cabinet to fight off the consolidators after she's gone. But looking through the possible right-wing contenders, Michael Patilla, for example, couldn't be moved so soon from environment selling the poll tax. And speculation goes that Francis Maude's chances were damaged by his marginal constituency. He may not survive the next election. While Michael Forsyth, though a favourite, would have been too controversial an appointment. Thatcher loyalists like Eric Forth, a fellow member of an influential right-wing dining club, believe Peter Lilly was an obvious candidate for promotion.
He and I are in a little group of MPs together who try to do a bit of thinking from time to time.
The No Turning Back group.
The No Turning Back group. It's also, I'm sure, his performance in a very difficult job, a notoriously difficult job at the Treasury, where he performed very ably and very securely. And also, I suspect that it's her confidence in his known beliefs, in the sort of things that the government and the DTI are constantly striving to do.
But Peter Lilly was chosen by Mrs Thatcher for the wrong reasons, according to MPs on the left of the party.
One always, I suppose, anticipated that he would be much more of a junior or middle-ranking minister, if he got a job at all. Mrs Thatcher herself is on the record a number of times in saying that she doesn't want, she's too busy to have ministers arguing with her about policies, even if they're complicated. So what she does prefer, very impressive people in many ways, very hard-working, is to have much more docile and malleable ministers.
The Conservative defeat at Eastbourne has fuelled the party's debate over its future, whether to go for more radicalism or to adopt a more cautious approach. How far can Peter Lilly help Mrs Thatcher push the radical line? He had an early interest in politics, though not from a political family. His father was a BBC personnel officer. He went to Dulwich College in London, where he was a keen Boy Scout, and then on to Clare College, Cambridge.
I was frightfully, pathologically shy at university, so I didn't get much involved there.
As Bow Group chairman, Peter Lilly pushed the traditionally left-leaning group to the right, with pamphlets like the Alternative Manifesto, written before the 1974 election.
I think the distinctive contribution we made was to work on the kind of policies like monetarism, reducing government expenditure, reducing intervention in industry, which became the significant themes of what has later become Thatcherism.
Well, I work for a big firm of stockbrokers, and I specialise in the oil industry.
But Peter Lilly's career in politics was much more important to him, despite an inauspicious debut at the 1982 Conservative Conference.
Is Mr. Lilly here to move his amendment? For the last time of asking, well, so be it.
I apologise for the delay. My extremely efficient room-maid had consigned my notes to the waste bin, and I've been tracing them back through the garbage system of the Royal Crescent Hotel, where some of you in due course maybe will think that they ought to remain.
He later tried to smooth over the political damage.
We don't do it, do the whibs. Heather Allen.
Elected for St Albans in 1983, he was clearly one of the new Thatcher generation of MPs.
Whereas the Wets, the ex-cabinet minister Wets, tend to be grandees, landowners, immensely wealthy, with a paternalistic approach to politics. The new intake tends to be self-made men of working class, lower middle class origin, and they are rather impatient of being lectured by people who are struggling by on 200,000 a year about the need to increase taxes, to increase social benefits.
It wasn't long before he became a minister in the Treasury as economic and then financial secretary. But while praised by many for his intellectual abilities behind the scenes, Peter Lilly's public persona was more problematic. To some colleagues, he appears quietly robust. To others, stiff and colourless.
We're opposed to it for several reasons.
But on this principal political point.
We're opposed to anything that's imposed centrally, not the result of evolution and individual choices.
Well, I think Peter Lilly comes over as very tense in the course of the interview. He tends to relax a bit more towards the end of the interview, but for most of it, he tends to, he makes speech errors at the start of the interview, quite pronounced speech errors. His facial expression also tends to be rather sort of blank, unsmiling. I think he looks rather drawn, and there are psychological studies that have shown that when people show a lack of facial expression, they're often physically very tense at the same time.
Isn't it fairly normal for people to be tense during television interviews?
Yes, I think that's true, but then a professional politician needs to be able to handle what may be a stressful situation, but it is part of his job.
This stiff image attracted an unusual sobriquet of the blonde Vulcan.
You remember Spock, the alien from the planet Vulcan in Star Trek? Pointed ears, entirely logical, no emotions. Peter Lilly is a rather cool-blooded character, extremely capable, very clever. At this stage in his career, a certain lack of passion. Whether his ears are pointed or not, I'm not yet sure.
Peter Lilly's mission is to boldly stay where few ministers have stayed before. There have been no fewer than 11 predecessors here, some founded for a variety of reasons, not all connected with the department. But nonetheless, many believe that the DTI is jinxed.
I know from my own experience that DTI is certainly one of the most varied departments in government, and also has acquired a reputation with some degree of foundation for having a large number of hidden problems which keep tumbling out.
But the DTI could also be a safe haven for a Thatcherite politician. Peter Lilly can push for deregulation, in telecommunications for example, rather than having to make difficult defences of health or education policy. It's thought he's planning a radical shake-up of the British Telecom Mercury duopoly in a review out next month. But he could face political difficulties if deregulation harms the interests of BT shareholders, who are encouraged by this government to invest. Could Peter Lilly face a clash with the Prime Minister? Samuel Britton knows Peter Lilly well. They wrote a book together in the 70s.
Mrs. Thatcher is not much of a Thatcherite. Peter Lilly is far more of a Thatcherite than the Prime Minister. But by that I mean believing in capitalism and market economics, even when it gets in the way of various popular political beliefs.
In the Conservative debate over Europe, there can be little doubt about Peter Lilly's anti-federalist views, in particular his firm opposition to signing up for the principle of monetary union, as some of his cabinet colleagues have suggested.
It's our practice normally only to accept principles that we want to implement, and that's something which some of our partners find difficult to cope with because they're used in their traditions to making declaratory laws that don't ever get implemented. That's a little failure to communicate because of that. But we're therefore unlikely to commit ourselves to something we don't want to do.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome here to Harpenden Michaelmas Fair. Could I begin by thanking everybody for producing such a wonderful display and array of produce.
Just 4 months ago, Peter Lilly was little known outside his St Albans seat. Now, arduous constituency duties apart, he's at the forefront of the Conservatives' central debate on how to fight the next election. He's in no doubt that what's needed is more radical policies.
There's a tendency now to say, oh, jolly good, won't be clever, let's sit back and do nothing. Well, obviously, people want to digest each change before moving on to the next. I'm not suggesting that we stuff the mouthful before the gullet has swallowed, so to speak. But we nonetheless can't just say we've reached the end of a road.
Peter Lilly's political future depends on who wins that debate. Ultimately, do voters want to consolidate, or are they too in favour of no turning back?
Peter Lilly, whose loyalty to the Prime Minister over Europe is in no doubt. And as I said, we will be hearing the Prime Minister's first response to what happened in Rome in just a moment, after our political editor, John Cole.
During the past week, Tory MPs have seemed more nervous than at any time since their poll tax crisis in the spring. Defeat at Eastbourne was the catalyst, but backbench critics summed up a multitude of grumbles in phrases like loss of touch, lack of flair and just plain inept. A measure of this gloom was that the usual keep calm tendency had turned into a positively optimistic tendency. A very senior figure streaking through the lobby assured me that he was bubbling with zest and added self-mockingly, "I don't know how I survived 3 months away from this place." One party manager did confess that they had to guard against headless chicken syndrome, backbenchers running around bleating their anxieties to journalists. But a whip assured me he was not suffering the ear bashings in the tea room that are his usual misery in times of adversity. Inevitably, the Prime Minister's position is a subject of gossip again. A conspirator produced his diary to show me that a challenger would not have to screw up his courage till the very end of November, when by-elections might have made things worse for her. Most MPs believe a challenge won't happen, and scepticism is certainly justified. I sometimes think dissident Tories regard political journalists as priests waiting in the members' lobby to receive their confessions of loss of faith in the Blessed Margaret's superhuman powers. Such conversations seem to absolve these MPs from any further action, such as confessing their doubts to their whip, an altogether more dangerous activity. The Eastbourne jitters of last weekend have been reignited by what one grumbler called knees jerking all over the place. This was a reference to the PM's unscheduled meetings with Norman Lamont, John McGregor and Tony Newton over decisions about spending on education and child benefits. Nigel Lawson, who in this Indian summer of his parliamentary career displays the best bother boy credentials since Dennis Healy hung up his boots, glared down at her and cruelly spoke up for restraint in spending, by-elections or no by-elections. Another Conservative critic, paraphrasing Beaverbrook's remarks on a beleaguered Lloyd George, opined that Mrs Thatcher no longer minds in what direction the bus is going so long as she's still in the driving seat. And the row over Europe bubbles on. A Labour woman student of Thatcher Europsychology scoffs at the theory that she still favours John Major as Crown Prince, and in an unconscious parody of Trollope hisses, she'll never forgive him for the exchange rate mechanism. But the backdrop to Conservative gloom is economic trouble and bad opinion polls. A senior minister notes that Labour support's been in the high 40s for a year now, compared with the low 30s before the last election, and mourns the absence of fragmentation in the opposition. So, expect Conservative attempts to win over more ex-Alliance voters. Party managers see them less as committed Liberals, more inhabitants of a transit camp who need rescuing from Labour. But that mood may change if forthcoming by-elections deal the government either a Labour or a Liberal Democrat jolt. For John Major's studied gloom about the 1991 economy has sent shivers through 76 Tory MPs with majorities of less than 10%. Many view next spring's poll tax round with horror. Revisiting inflation, as one minister describes it, is a less convincing government activity than the first battle 10 years ago. A professional pessimist said, "It's all given from here on, decline and fall." But then he spoils the solemnity by adding with a merry laugh, "Put me down as a senior backbencher," as if we'd ever admit there were any junior ones, any more than newspaper diaries recognise other than top models. More seriously, a minister has heard colleagues musing whether a period in opposition might not actually help the Conservatives. So far, the Gulf crisis has protected Margaret Thatcher's back against a series of political blows. Reports of constituency chairmen who mutter about the need for a change and MPs picking up that elegant supermarket phrase about shelf life are hardly unprecedented. But the PM, having survived plotting during the Ides of March, will still be nervous about the Ides of November, and she won't finally be out of the woods until after a tricky set of local elections next May. After that, she'd be free to concentrate on Neil Kinnock.
But before that, back to those woods in Rome. After the 11 had announced they were going to press on to economic and monetary union, leaving Britain isolated, the Prime Minister spoke to Brian Hanrahan, who asked her about the principles that were at stake.
The question of a future European currency, the other 11 appear to have agreed a goal of a single currency and a timetable to phase it in. Hasn't Britain been bypassed in these discussions?
No, we've never been bypassed in them. We certainly have a different route. We're prepared to have a common currency alongside our own national currency, so we should keep the pound sterling. Others seem to be prepared at this stage to go for a single currency, but they have not really got down to the conditions, because really you couldn't possibly have a single currency while the economies of the members of the community are so very widely different. At any rate, if you did, they'd require enormous amounts of extra money money to their own economies in order to sustain them through it. None of that has been discussed. The real discussion has still to come, and it is quite absurd to preempt it in this Council.
But the others here seem to have agreed on their aims. Haven't we forfeited our voice by not joining in that discussion at this point?
No, most certainly not. We have put up an alternative route, which they haven't really discussed either, and they have not got beyond the general objective, which we do not agree with as a single currency, as distinct from a common currency. And of course, until you get down to the details, you do not know quite what it involves. And that was proved when we started to talk about trading matters which are urgent and have to be agreed before the end of this year. They couldn't agree because it was detail which affects each of them differently. And so when it's distant, you can talk in grand, general, vague terms. When it's immediate, it's much more difficult. So we didn't take the urgent decisions on trade. We have in fact got to communicate on vague things.
You don't feel that by turning your back on the discussions they wanted, they've turned their back on you and refused to include you in these?
What are you saying turning our back on them? There is going to be a conference of members of governments to discuss this matter that will start in December. It's quite absurd to try to preempt what they will discuss or their conclusions at this conference.
When December comes and we go into a conference and the others have already set an aim which you are dissenting from, what will Britain do at that point? Are you prepared to block agreement towards that aim?
I think we will go into that conference and discuss it, and I think when they discuss the details, they will find that there are very, very many difficulties for a number of them in attaining that objective. You couldn't possibly have a single currency with someone whose country has a totally different economy, a much poorer economy. You couldn't sustain it. You would have to, in fact, really slash your expenditure. You'd probably have an enormous amount of unemployment. What you would come along and say is, please, we want a terrific amount of aid from the rest of you in order to do this. Well, now, we in Britain are a very big contributor to the community, even though we get some rebates. We already contribute annually to the community £2.2 billion. That is about £500 million more contributing to the community than we give to the third world. So obviously we're not going to get involved in even more subsidies to others. All of this will come up as it's discussed in detail. It was not considered today. And you'll find a very, very different view coming out when we get down to those details.
There is a suggestion that Britain could work its way back into the common flow here by accepting, in principle, a goal down the line, but take its time about coming in. Could you accept that?
No, I would not. Most certainly not. I would not accept a single currency and the abolition of the pound sterling. Nor would our Parliament, nor do I believe with the British people.
So it is not a question of the timetable, this is a question of principle, something you cannot accept.
I would not accept to have the community saying we must abolish the pound sterling. We will not have that imposed upon us. I don't know what a Parliament in 40, 50 years' time will say. What I do know now is I'm not prepared to go to Parliament and suggest we abolish the pound sterling, and if I were, it would not get through. I think the most obvious practical expression of your sovereignty is your currency. Your currency, your coin and your notes, and your capacity to uphold that currency by your monetary and economic policy. And we're prepared to have a common currency. We're not prepared to have a single currency imposed upon us.
Do you think that this means, if you're in such fundamental disagreement with the others and their goals, that it's time to rethink Britain's position within the common market?
I still think that you haven't taken on board what I said before. We have not got down to the detail. There are some of those countries who are not in the European exchange rate mechanism, which we've joined. There are some of those countries which still have foreign exchange control. They couldn't possibly sustain a single currency.
But they're subscribing to it as a goal, which
maybe
you are
they
not
are.
prepared to do.
Maybe they are. They can do that. But when it gets down to the detail of how you bring it about, they will not be able to, quite a number of them.
The Prime Minister putting it on the line and saying no single currency for 40 or 50 years to Brian Hanrahan, at the end of what has been a much more dramatic summit than anyone had ever imagined. Anyway, that's all for this Sunday. Next Sunday we have the rare, if not a unique encounter of a Cabinet Minister in free and open debate with a member of the public on a great political issue. The Cabinet Minister is Chris Patten, the member of the public is Jonathan Porritt, and the issue, the future of the global environment. Not to be missed. On the Record next Sunday. Till then, goodbye.